Howdy, howdy. It's Phil here. It's Q&A number 6. And today's question is an interesting one that I've never really thought about. It comes from Kimberly Calkins Ingalls. It's hard to say, Kimberly. I don't know why. And Kimberly asked, what questions do you like and dislike that send you off to extremes? And I had to think about that one. I've done a lot of interviews over the years, radio, podcasts, newspapers, whatever. So I think my answer here specifically is about being interviewed for something and not the type of things that you guys ask me, which, especially if you're new to the community, every question is valid. I think what irritates me in interviews is when the interviewer has obviously not done any research on my work at all, and they're just sort of coming in blind, and they ask me questions that are very surface. Not just the how'd you get into comedy kind of question, which again, you guys are welcome to ask that because you're new to the community and don't really know my work yet. Somebody who's interviewing me for a publication or a podcast or whatever it is, I would expect maybe would have done a little bit of work, or in the case of radio, had their assistant or the producer do a little bit of work. So things like that are just real surface, real basic, real easy questions about, stories I've told 1,000 times. I see their place because certainly the listeners are new to my work as well. But they don't know anything about me if I'm a guest on some show they're just listening to. But I think there's more interesting ways to pose some of those questions where the interviewer could say, I read that here's how you got into comedy, basically, and then sort of expand on some of that. So I kind of like when interviewers have done a little bit of research on me, they can, tell a little bit of that story for me up front in an abbreviated form and then allow me to expand on it. In other cases, like if it's a podcast I've been on a few times before, or something like that, here's the kind of questions I really like. I like questions about the process, the creation process. One that springs to mind is I was on the Funk podcast, the Funny Music Project podcast, when Sweatpants came out. And we were discussing, I was telling them that I had, very purposefully made it a Van Halen pastiche. And Tom, the host, he said, well, how did you do that? Because it really does sound like Van Halen. Tell us about how you actually did that. That was a great question because that allowed me to then go into and explain the process of how I captured a Van Halen sound in that song, especially considering that's not my normal sound per se. So I like questions about the process. I like questions about the work, and I certainly don't mind questions about the experience of being a comedian or a musician from somebody who's not that. And those are always interesting when we can tell road stories and things like that. But besides that, I don't think there's any questions that really drive me crazy. It might if I were doing one of these all-day press junkets. An actress. I can't think of her name. One of the Marvel actresses. Was it Charlize Theron? Might have been Charlize Theron. And somebody asked her it was Charlize Theron and Chris Pratt. And they asked Chris Pratt something about the craft of acting. And then they asked Charlize Theron what her diet was like to get in shape for the part. And she said, why don't you ask Chris Pratt that? Why don't you ask me about the craft? Those kinds of things, I can absolutely see how that would drive somebody nuts, especially if it's the 5th time that day that you've been asked that kind of thing. But I don't do all-day press junkets. And so I don't think there's a lot of stuff that, makes me angry to answer or things like that. Because, of course, also being not a woman, I don't encounter a lot of that stuff. But I think that's it. Yeah, I don't find anything that really sends me off to, dislike land. I'm always happy to answer things. But I do think that some interviewers, especially if we're doing a long form podcast or something like that, could do a little more research into the guests before getting there. And I will say, as a former podcast host, I was probably guilty of doing that same thing with my guests, of who, especially ones that I didn't know that well. But I did always make an effort if I had somebody, a pretty big name on, I did make an effort to come up with creative questions that I thought they might not have been asked before. And those are always the most exciting ones. Being asked something that you've never been asked before. For instance, like today, when Kimberly asked me, which questions do I hate and really like? And because I've never been asked that before, and I think that's an interesting question. I would sometimes, in my podcast, ask people, is there a question that I haven't asked you that you want to answer? Or is there a question that you've never been asked that you want to answer? And that would oftentimes bring up some interesting conversations. But that's more of an interviewing technique, a training kind of thing, more so than anything that I do. Now, by the way, if you've never heard my podcast, which is a finished show at this point, I don't do new episodes. It was a podcast called Under the Crossbones. All the episodes are still up on anywhere that you listen to podcasts at, because I pay the $7 a month to keep them there. And it's a show completely about pirates. So if you like pirates, then check out Under the Crossbones. It's a fun show. Lots of cool guests, musicians and screenwriters and actors and historians and authors and composers and things like that. There's all sorts of great stuff on there. So anyway, I think that's my answer. Thank you very much, Kimberly, for that great question. If you have a question that you would like me to answer in one of these videos, I'm absolutely happy to do so. And so you can just drop it in a comment below or send me an email, phil@philjohnsоncomedy.com, and drop it in. And I'll talk with you soon.